Okay, this segment of the video will be on cat handling and control. And once you've hooked up to a crazy catfish, you need to exercise caution to minimize harm to both you and the fish. Catfish are big and strong, and they can do some damage both to you and your gear if you don't do things right. This segment we will quickly cover the basic elements of handling and control, including landing nets, lip grippers, and the best way to hold cats with your hands. We'll also show you how to remove the spines on any fish that you plan to keep, and the options for keeping them fresh in a live well, a cooler, or a basket, or on a stringer. And at the end of the segment, there'll be some live action video demos. First, a quick review of catfish anatomy to remind you of why it's important to use proper handling procedures. First of all, catfish have three nasty spines, one on each of the two pectoral fins and one on the dorsal fin. Younger and smaller catfish have smaller and sharper spines, and the younger the sharper. They tend to get worn down and dull as the fish get older and spend a few spawning sessions rolling in the rocks or just hanging out and feeding in the rocks. On a live fish, there's a soft mucus covering over the spines, and that covering contains a very painful toxin. It's not bad enough to be fatal, but it hurts bad enough you almost wish you could die. But even without the toxin, you'll be in a world of hurt if you get spined by a catfish. The points are sharp, they penetrate flesh easily, and with the backward facing barbs, they do a lot of damage if you try to pull them back out. This is my hand, what it looked like after a cookie cutter catfish at Willard Bay got me in a moment of inattention. Well, that was definitely an owie. And even if the spines don't penetrate you, they can still slice you up. As in this picture, they're very sharp along the edges. And those sharp spines will also cut your line, or at least put nicks in it if the fish rolls up in your line, as they often do. So you'll either lose the fish that you're fighting, or maybe the next one if you fail to check for nicks and don't retie your line. One of the first things to make sure you have when you're fishing for catfish is a good net. My wife in this picture has just netted a cat bigger than she was expecting. Poor baby. Now, she could have benefited by having a net with a longer handle and a bigger bag, or one with tangle-proof rubber netting instead of that nylon. But she got her done. Never try to lip a catfish like I'm doing with this smallmouth bass. You get a painfully chomped thumb and probably lose some skin. Channel cats have a pretty powerful bite, and even though they don't have teeth, they have strong crusher jaws. But in other species, the flathead, they do have rows of sharp little teeth, and they can draw blood. Can't believe how many guys noodle for them by shoving their hands down into the fish's mouths. Guess some people will do anything to lose weight. And one of the best things you can have for catfish is a lip gripper, and they come in either metal or plastic. I prefer the plastic. First of all, they don't damage the fish as much, and second of all, if you drop them over the side, they float. Now, the grippers also help a lot when you're showing off a catch for pictures, or just for controlling the fish while you're putting it in a live well, a cooler, or a basket, or even while just releasing it unharmed. This picture shows a good combination of a rubberized net and a plastic lip gripper on a cat that fell for a bait that had bling beads on it. And once you have the cat subdued, you can more readily and more safely handle it with your hands. And the best grip for this is a good old belly grip with the fingers wrapped around the pectoral spines as shown in this picture. In larger and older cats, with spines dulled from feeding or spawning on the rocks, you can more safely grip them just behind the head and across the back as shown here. And once you have the fish gripped and controlled, you can decide whether or not to release her to keep it. And if you want to keep it for later filleting and cooking, it's usually a good idea to remove the spines first. Now, this reduces the potential for damage to you or your gear while you're still out on the water, but it's especially helpful when handling and filleting the fish later. These rigid spines can really increase the effort necessary to hold the fish flat while you're filleting it. And if the spines are still intact, a sudden flip or lunge by the fish is not nearly so potentially dangerous if the spines have been removed beforehand. Now, if the fish is not too big and the spines are not too rough, you can be able to just break them off with a pair of pliers. But otherwise, it's a good idea to carry some heavy side cutters capable of cutting through tougher spines. And this shows the dorsal spine removed with the side cutters. Now, if you're keeping fish for the table, you should try to keep them as fresh as possible. And if you're in a boat with a live well, that's a good option. Otherwise, a cooler with some ice is the next best way to preserve your catch. But if you're in a float tube or a pontoon or a kayak, you have the option of using either a fish basket or some kind of a stringer. Now, when I go afloat in my float tube, I hang a 19 by 30 inch wire fish basket over the side, and this basket's large enough to keep several eater-sized cats alive and well until I get back to shore in the fish cleaning station. Now, I brought in many limits of 8 catfish, all alive and healthy in my fish basket. On one occasion, I even had a 34-inch cat in the basket temporarily while I kicked back into shore for measuring and pictures before I released it. Some folks love rope stringers, and they're fine for stringing up a lot of panfish or a few trout, but for catfish, not so much. But I have used rope stringers off my tube a time or two to hold fish that were too big to put in the basket, and I decided to keep anyway. Now, some problems are better to have than others, but it can be problematic to have a large fish tangling your legs up in a float tube with a stringer rope. Then there are the chain stringers. This is one of the common wimpy ones, but there are stronger ones available. Most models are too weak to hold big cats, but I have used them, and here's my wife with some cats from Willard Bay after a night of fishing. But the next picture is the stringer made from rope, and we had to use that one night after our first 2 fish tore up the chain stringer. Both of those fish were in the 10-pound range, and when they ganged up on that poor chain stringer, it didn't have a chance. Now, let's take a look at a couple of live action videos. With the net here, and bring him in and turn him loose too. And one thing about the catfish is you always want to have a good net, and having one with the rubber mesh is good, because some of those nylon nets, they get all wrapped up in and nasty. So rubber mesh, you don't get nearly as many tangles in these fins. And again, there's the old pink tiger, and easily release this one, hopefully. There we go. Now, one of the things, if I was going to be keeping this fish, I would take either these pliers and break off the fins before I put it in a basket, because that helps prevent damage to the basket, and also prevents damage to the angler, and makes it a lot easier for filleting later. Now, if the fins are too big and you can't break them easily with a pair of long-nosed pliers or something, then you get a pair of heavy side cutters like this, and they'll do the job. But this one, we're not going to keep him, so we won't take his fins off. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what you do if you're going to keep a catfish for putting in a basket or taking them home to fillet. First thing I do is I break off these spines, the pectoral spines, and the dorsal spines. Now, if you get one with a real heavy spine and pliers won't work, or you're just a wimp, then you need a pair of heavy side cutters. Those usually make short work of them. Okay, now that they're finless, spineless, they handle a lot better back at the fillet table. They also don't get stuck in your net. It looks like I've got another bite going on this other rod over here. Okay, now let's talk about filleting catfish. Once you have some cats and you have to decide what to do to get them ready for the table, most seasoned cataholics prefer to fillet and skin their catch. And in this section we'll discuss several different options using either regular fillet knives or electric fillet knives. And at the end of the classroom part, I'll be showing some actual filleting videos that should help you a lot with visualizing the processes. And what we won't suggest is using the old traditional method of skinning a catfish by nailing their head to a tree and then pulling the skin down toward the tail. That method is still in use by a lot of cat fans around the country, but for the average sized catfish it's definitely more difficult and more time consuming than quickly filleting and skinning them with a good electric knife. On the other hand, filleting and skinning a big old blue cat or a big flathead is more like butchering a hog than cleaning a fish, and requires a whole different set of skills and procedures. Over the span of many years, I've used just about every make and model of fillet knife on the market. And during my time as a deckhand on Southern California party boats and some commercial fishing, I learned a lot about knives and filleting. And I maintained a rack of several fillet knives of different sizes and shapes and for different filleting chores, and did keep them super sharp. That's one of the keys. I got pretty good at turning out good fillets in good time and managed to avoid just turning big ones into little ones, which is a term on the boats for poor filleting. I still keep and use a few regular fillet knives, but filleting catfish, wipers, and a few other tough bone species, I do much prefer using an electric. And my electric of choice these days is the Bubba Blade. It has a powerful motor and comes with an assortment of different blades, and the handle is very ergonomically designed for long sessions of comfortable filleting. It's also sold in a cordless rechargeable model, which is quite popular and works very well. I have used, and I still have, a 12-volt portable fillet knife that runs off my car battery or one of the little 7 amp hour batteries that I used to use for my sonar setup. It's made by American Angler, and it's a special high power model that has a motor almost as powerful as the 120-volt model. For a time I had a rechargeable cordless model for remote location filleting, but I found it to be a poor design ergonomically, and it was just not powerful enough to work through a large batch of large catfish. I no longer have that one. Okay, now let's fillet some catfish. Again, I'll be doing some videos later, but here's the pictorial part. Starts out by using the Bubba Blade electric, and I start by making the first cut right behind the fish's head down to the spine. Now, next I rotate the blade and move it down toward the tail, letting the knife do the work, and just begin running along the spine. As I reach the tail, I have the option of continuing the cut until the entire fillet is removed with the skin still on it, or else stopping the cut before severing the skin at the tail. Option A is to stop the cut, and using the knife blade, flip the new fillet over onto the skin side. Now, option A skinning technique involves carefully cutting down through the fillet at the tail juncture just until you reach the skin, and then rotate the blade to run between the skin and the flesh, keeping the blade flat against the fillet table until it comes out the end and leaves a skinless fillet. Next, using the point of the blade, make a quick slice around the rib cage and remove the ribs. Okay, let's look at option B. This begins with completing the fillet cut all the way to the tail and severing the skin, resulting in a fillet with the skin still on and the ribs still intact. Now, to skin this fillet, we use the rib cage as a handle. Make a cut down around the rib cage, but not cutting through the skin. Then rotate the blade flat and guide it down between the skin and the flesh, holding onto the rib cage for support. This is the second way to get a skinless and boneless fillet, and it's very easy for most folks to learn. Now, if your cat's not too big and the rib bones are not too heavy, you can still do a decent job of filleting with a regular knife, but it should be one with a stout blade and has to be sharp. Wimpy, short, flexible blades literally won't cut it for filleting any size catfish. Now again, the first cut is made right behind the head, down to the spine. And again, the blade is then worked in a seesaw motion down along the spine to cut through the ribs and to remove the fillet, using either option A or option B as previously discussed. Now for skinning, you hold the carcass with one hand as a handle while working the knife down between the skin and the flesh with the blade. Now you remove the rib bones. Remove the rib bones according to whatever option you choose. Last in the filleting option is rib-free filleting, and this is using a regular fillet knife to cut around the ribs during the fillet process to leave the ribs behind on the carcass. And it begins like most filleting options with a straight cut down behind the head, stopping at the spine. Step 2 is to turn the knife, but begin cutting a line down the back all the way to the tail, and then bring the knife back up and cut all the way through until the knife stops at the ribs. Now cut around the ribs, working the knife point down to the bottom edge of the ribs, and unlike other filleting methods, you haven't cut through the stomach cavity. Now, step 4 is push the point of the knife through to the bottom of the fillet once you pass the ribs and out through the skin, and then begin the seesawing cutting along the spine to detach the fillet. Now, stop cutting before separating the fillet by cutting through the skin so that you can flip the fillet over for skinning. But then move the knife back up and slice down at an angle to slice out the rib cage. And when the rib cage cut is complete, lift the boneless fillet and flip it over onto the skin side for skinning. Now, keeping again a cut into the flesh at the base of the tail and down to the skin to begin the skinning process. And keeping the knife blade flat against the table, seesaw the blade back and forth to finish skinning the fillet. Now you have a skinless, boneless fillet, and the ribs are still attached to the carcass for disposal. Okay, let's now see how this stuff works on video. Okay, going to talk a little bit about filleting. You can use a regular knife, or you can use an electric knife. I happen to prefer the electric, which this model is a bubble blade, which is very strong. I'll show you first. You can fillet catfish with a regular knife. Now this is a fairly heavy blade, which is what you want because going through catfish ribs is not easy, especially when they're flopping around. Okay, so once you're through the ribs, it goes pretty fast down toward the tail. But still a little bit of work with this regular knife. When you get to the tail, you flip it over, and then you do the skinning. Believe me, it's so much easier with a electric knife. Now there's one other way you can fillet a catfish with a regular knife, and that is you can cut behind the head, then you cut to the rib cage along the spine, and then once you get past the rib cage, you push the knife straight on through, go down and cut this off, and then cut around the rib cage. Okay, and there you've got the rib cage cut out and the fillet. Now you have to skin it, so you can hold on like that and skin it. On this one we still have to cut the rib cage out, so I'll do it that way. That gives us two nice little fillets we put into the water, and we're ready for the next one. Do it the bubble blade, and I'll fillet them two ways. First, which is the standard way, going right down through the rib cage all the way to the end, but don't cut through. Flip over the fillet, and then skin it. Do the same on the other side. Cut down to the backbone, cut through the rib cage. This bubble blade is really good at cutting through those ribs very easily. Okay, once again we flip it over, put the knife down between the skin and the flesh, hold it flat against the table, and pull on the skin at the same time as you're cutting, and you end up with a fillet that now all you need to do is remove the bones, cut those out, cut those out. We have two more fillets to put into the water. Okay, the third one we'll do a little differently. We'll go ahead and cut down through, but this time we're going to remove the whole fillet. Cut all the way through, fillet is removed, flip it over, and do the second side, cut down through, run the knife all the way down to remove the fillet all the way, cut through the skin. Okay, now we've got two fillets with the skin on and the rib cage still in. But one thing you can do is cut down through, not quite all the way through the skin, and then once you have that groove, you can use that to hold on to the rib cage as a handle, and then run the knife down to remove the fillet, and you've got the skin with the ribs attached. Same thing on the second fillet, cut partially through, all the way down to the bottom, and the fillet is removed. See? Simple, right? Okay, we're going to show an optional way to fillet a cat using the regular fillet knife. Start by making the cut behind the head as usual. Bring it around and run the knife along the spine and around the rib cage. Run the knife along the spine and around the rib cage, all the way down. Bring it all the way through, and then you can either cut it through or you can leave it. But in this case, what we do is we cut around the rib cage. That cuts the fillet loose, leaving the ribs in place. And then we flip the fish around, Do the skinning. Put the knife blade between the skin and the flesh. Seesaw all the way down. And we have a skinless, boneless fillet. Do the same on the opposite side. Start with a cut behind the head. Down to the ribs. And to the ribs. And then around. And cut the fillet off all the way down to the tail. Cut around the ribs. Lift the fillet. Flip the fillet over. And do the skinning. And again, we end up with a skinless, boneless fillet. And the ribs are left intact on the carcass. Okay, this section is on trimming and prepping. It's kind of an extension of the filleting process, but worthy of separate treatment. Now, catfish can be great on the table, but they can be less than great if they're not properly handled and prepared before cooking. Much of the potential for good versus bad revolves around the fact that catfish have denser and oilier flesh than many other species, and that means we should usually cook them a bit longer to ensure thorough cooking. But most people who claim to not like catfish have been served catfish that was not cooked well enough, and when properly cooked, catfish have a firm, flaky white flesh that is the equal of many of the more prestigious species. Now, one thing that can be done after filleting is to cut or trim the fillets into thinner pieces of roughly equal size and thickness. And that'll help ensure that all the pieces are properly cooked and the thicker pieces are not served underdone. Now, for most average-sized cats, under about 3 to 4 pounds, you can simply cross-cut the fillets into what I call catfish fingers. Bet you didn't think catfish had fingers, did you? Well, this is a quick and easy to do, and it results in pieces that are all pretty equal in size for more even cooking. And these fingers then become ideal for many other recipes, frying, baking, grilling, and so forth. And as we'll show later in this video, catfish fingers are about the best way to make kitty crispies, and the fried results can then be turned into catfish wings and some of the other dishes. Stay tuned. Now, the older the fish and the larger the fillets, the more likely there will be a thicker line of dark red flesh along the lateral line. Now, some folks refer to this as the blood line or fatty tissue, but it's actually sensory tissue that helps receive and interpret the vibrations in the water to help fish locate food during poor light or poor visibility conditions. And it does have a stronger taste, which a lot of people find objectionable, but it is easily removed. You just take a small knife with a thin, sharp blade and make shallow cuts in toward the center to loosen the dark strip. Then free up one end and run the knife down under the strip all the way down to lift and remove the dark flesh. If there's some left on either side of the main strip, it's usually not enough to notice in the cooked fillet. The next steps are optional. If you wish to optimize the fillets for even cooking and maximum quality on the table or smoking, after removing the dark tissue, you can make some more minor cuts to remove a thin line of yellow oily tissue that sometimes occurs along the top and bottom of the fillets. Depending on the fish's diet, this may not even be visible and may not be necessary, but trimming the top and bottom edge further ensures more even cooking. And the tail section is usually much thinner than the upper part of the fillet, so slicing it off and removing it further contributes to uniformity of thickness. Now, once you've made all of those trimming cuts shown, you'll have 3 fairly equal pieces for the fry pan or the smoker. Now, some folks might be concerned with the waste pieces, but if you beer steam them, and dip them in garlic butter, you have some pretty good snack tidbits or fixings for a salad. Another good option, especially if you've cleaned a large batch of cats and have a goodly amount of trimmings, is to make some po man shrimp. Get some shrimp bouillon cubes, dissolve a couple in a quart or more of water, and add salt, pepper, and garlic, and onion flakes. Bring it to a simmer, add the cat trimmings. In about 8 to 10 minutes, the fish pieces will be falling apart flaky. And then you make a dip of melted butter, shrimp bouillon, and garlic, and just pig out. It's as good as any crab or shrimp, and you just make it with trimmings. Very good stuff. Okay, let's talk about trimming and pre-preparation on catfish for the table or the smoker. Now, catfish to begin with are a heavier, denser, oilier flesh fish than most of the white meat species that we're used to, like bass or walleye or crappie or crappie, white bass, whatever. So they take a little longer cooking, and they sometimes benefit by a little extra trimming to remove some of the stronger tasting flesh. Now, catfish that come from good clean waters with a good clean diet, and they're a little smaller, haven't lived a long time, and accumulate a lot of wonderful flavors, they're usually okay to cook whole if you want. But the older a fish is, the bigger it is, the more varied its diet, the greater the chance that it'll benefit by some judicious trimming. Now, people that don't like catfish usually don't, because they've been served catfish that's been undercooked or poorly trimmed, and that's not a good way to be introduced to catfish. So the first thing to do, if you're going to trim up a catfish, is look for the red sensory tissue runs along the lateral line. This is a sensory tissue that helps a catfish pick up the vibrations in the water to help find its prey during nighttime or poor visibility conditions. And it's a little different texture and definitely a stronger taste than the other flesh, so it's one of the first things you can do to help improve the flavor of your catfish. And that's easy to remedy by taking a small sharp bladed knife and cutting in under the red tissue along both sides, making a shallow cut into the center, and then starting at one end. When you have it loose, work your way down and cut it loose, and then discard it. That won't be of any use later. Now, once you have the skinless, boneless fillet and the red meat removed, chances are that fillet is okay to cook whole. You can bake it, broil it, fry it, grill it, smoke it, whatever you want. It'll be good just about anyway. Okay, now we're going to trim the catfish for proper cooking, and that consists of making little ones out of big ones, as I call it. Take the bigger pieces and cut them into smaller pieces so that they cook more uniformly, and they all come out of the fryer or the smoker at the same time, equally cooked. Now, the first thing you do here is you'll flip it over, and you notice in the filleting process there have been some less than appealing tissue left top and bottom, and also at the bottom, or actually the top of the fillet, you notice a line of yellow. This is where the oily tissue concentrates in a catfish if it's had a healthy diet. Really not too strong tasting. Some people object to it, but if you want to reduce the omega-3 in your diet, start by cutting that long strip of flesh out, discard it, cut that bottom strip of flesh out and discard it. Okay, now we come down to where the fillet comes from thicker to thinner. I usually cut off that in 2 to 3 inches. Not that it's not good eating, but for uniformity, we'll put that aside and we'll use that later, as I'll show you. Now, one of the cuts that you can make for uniformity is to cross-cut the fillet into catfish fingers, but you didn't know catfish had fingers. It's about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch wide, and these are very easy to coat and go in the fryer. I've got this one longer piece up here. Trim that piece and save it. Cut this down the middle. Okay, now all of these pieces will go in the fryer and cook up fairly uniformly. Now the other option is to cut it into 3 equal pieces. We'll start out the same way. We'll remove the dark meat, flip it over, remove the thin line at the top with the extra oil and objectionable parts, thinner pieces, discard that. And then we again come up here where it starts to get thicker, cut that off, set that aside for future reference. The next cut is right down the middle of the fillet. Okay, now we end up with one long fillet. You can keep that whole, or you can cut it in 2 pieces. And the bottom part, I usually cut that tag end off, just again to keep it uniform in size, and I save that for future reference. So that gives you 3 pieces that will go well in the fryer or the smoker. Now what you end up with these extra pieces, if you're filleting a lot of catfish, you end up with quite a bit of these pieces. If you don't mind throwing away some good fish flesh, go ahead. But I like to make what I call po man shrimp. And what I do is I put enough water in a pan to cover all the available pieces I've got, get it boiling at a simmer, and then I put in 1 or 2 pieces of this shrimp bouillon called caldo de camarón, because it's used a lot by the Hispanics. That melts in the water and stirs in and flavors it up. Okay, once you've got that mixed into the water, put your pieces in it, simmer them for about 8 to 10 minutes till the pieces are white and flaky. Dip them out, put them in a bowl. At that point, you can put them in the refrigerator, cool them down, and use them in a salad later. Or, as I like to do, make po man shrimp out of them and mix up some garlic butter and dip the freshly cooked hot fillets right in that garlic butter. It's as good as any shrimp or crab you could imagine. Now an option is, instead of putting the shrimp bouillon in the water, put a can of beer in the water and simmer them in beer water for the 8 to 10 minutes, and then mix a cube of the shrimp bouillon in with your garlic butter mix, and that makes really good stuff. But you might have to mix this up in a little warm water to dissolve it before you mix it in the garlic butter. But the stuff is good enough that once you try these leftover pieces as po man shrimp, you're liable to go back and take some of your other pieces you meant for frying and cook them up that way. It's really good stuff. Okay, this is our last video segment in the 2-part series. It's catfish cookery. And a lot of anglers get a lot more excited about catching catfish than eating them. And the 2 main reasons most folks don't eat and enjoy catfish more is because they had a bad batch of improperly cooked kiddies, or they just don't have the knowledge and experience to fully take advantage of all the different ways that catfish can be served. Catfish are different when it comes to preparing and eating them. They have a great mild tasting flesh that usually comes out nice and white and flaky if properly cooked. But failing to properly fillet, trim, and cook catfish can result in displeased diners. But that's no different than any other species of fish. All fish have their own unique properties that require individual attention to get the best possible results on the table. Now, in this final segment of the video, I'll try to introduce some really good ways to fix catfish so that you'll never have to worry about the reception from your guests, or so that you'll always want to keep a few to eat whenever you get some. The different cooking methods will include fried, baked, broiled, and grilled. Also talk about some soups like chili and chowder. And one of my fave kitty delights is catfish wings. Bet you didn't think catfish had wings, right? And we can't forget fish tacos and po' boy sandwiches. And a great place for using Kitty Crispies from fried up catfish fingers. And then of course there's smoked catfish, and some that's been left in the smoker long enough to become jerky. All great stuff. Let's start off with Kitty Crispies. This has long been my favorite way to introduce someone new to eating catfish. And if you cook them thoroughly, everyone will keep coming back until they destroy all the evidence. And you start by cutting the fillets into fingers as shown in the previous segment, and then you coat them with a dry coating, not a batter, of a mix of Bisquick and yellow cornmeal, along with whatever salt, pepper, garlic, cayenne, or other seasonings you favor. Now, you don't need to marinate the fish in anything, but some folks like to soak them in salted water or even buttermilk for a few hours before cooking. Some claim that helps remove any of that catfish flavor. Now, there's no need to dip the fillets in egg or wash or anything like that, but just make sure the fillets should be at least water wet or damp when you shake them up in the bag with a dry mix coating. Then you remove them from the bag and allow them to sit a few minutes and the coating to bond to the fish. Then, in a deep fryer or deep pan, have at least a couple of inches of peanut oil heated to about 375 degrees. It shouldn't be too hot, or the coating will cook and turn dark brown before the fish is properly cooked inside. Sometimes it takes a little practice to get it just right. And don't try to cook too many pieces at a time. As the fish cooks, it will lose moisture and it tends to float. And when the pieces are all floating and the coating is a nice rich brown, scoop them out with a slotted spoon or a dipper and put them on some paper towels to drain off the excess oil. And then serve them with optional dipping sauces like tartar sauce, hot sauce, barbecue, or if you like Chinese, even try some sweet and sour. Good stuff. Next example is a picture of coconut fried fish. Now again, proper time and temperature control are necessary to ensure that the fish is cooked before the coconut gets too dark. Ditto for baking with some coconut sprinkled on top. Might help to put the coconut on later in the baking process. Regulate the temperature to avoid over darkening the coconut, and then the white flesh of the catfish will be yummy. Next couple of pictures is on tempura. The first pic shows a serving of freshly deep fried tempura battered catfish finger strips, showing the pretty white flesh of the cooked catfish. And the important thing here is to have thin pieces so the fish gets properly cooked when the tempura is done. The next picture is a recipe. Feel free to do a screen capture if you want to make a copy of this recipe. Now, this picture of oven broiling is actually some trout fillets, but catfish work fine oven broiled too. Just again, make sure the pieces are thin enough to cook thoroughly, and only put a single layer in a glass baking dish or over foil. Use salt, pepper, garlic, sesame seeds, and other seasonings to your pleasure, and then dot the fillets with butter and bake for about 20 to 25 minutes at 350. Be sure to test for doneness. Make sure they're flaky and white with a fork before you serve them. Now, one variation of the oven baking is to top everything with some uncooked shrimp before you put them in the oven. I call this surf and serve. Earlier I mentioned catfish wings. Now, this starts by making some Kitty Crispies, fried strips of catfish in a dry coating mix. And once they're cooked, then you can toss them in your favorite wing sauce and just love the results. And just in case you haven't tried to make your own wing sauce, here's a quick guide. Of course, you can change up the ingredients or modify it in any way you want. But basically just Louisiana hot sauce and butter, with a little garlic powder and cayenne pepper. And if you need to thicken it up a little bit, just add a little bit of flour. But good stuff, you'll love it. Catfish chili? Well, don't knock it until you've tried it. Either make the chili from scratch yourself, or simply open a couple of cans of your favorite stuff and bring it up to heat, cut some catfish into nuggets, and add them to the chili after you brought it up to a simmer. About 10 minutes stirred and heated will usually see the fish just about well done enough for dining. You might want to cook them a little longer if the pieces are a little thicker. Chowder? You betcha. I use a cream of potato soup base, but before putting the canned soup into the pan, I cook up some bacon pieces and then cook some potato pieces, some mushrooms and onions, and the bacon renderings. Now mix some whole milk and a cube of butter into the soup mix. Bring it to a simmer and add plenty of catfish nuggets. And again, it takes about 10 to 15 minutes simmering to get the fish properly cooked. But sometimes it's even best to let the chowder rest a while and then reheat it. Get all the flavors blended and make sure the fish is properly cooked. Now, this is a picture of the ingredients that I use for a large batch, what I call pig out chowder. Of course, you can scale it down for smaller batches. Next is what I call scampi style, sauteed in olive oil and butter with some minced garlic. Of course, you can use other seasonings as well, but the pieces of catfish should be fairly thin so they'll properly cook before the garlic gets overcooked. It's also helpful to wait until the fish are about half done before you put the garlic in, just to make sure that it doesn't get overdone. Now, when the fish is done, serve it over rice or noodles, and then pour some of the pan drippings over it all and listen to your arteries harden. If you like to grill, get a basket like the one in this picture and put some catfish fillets in it. Properly done, they come out super white and flaky and rival any other fish you could serve. I do a lot of cats from Willard Bay this way and refer to them as Willard Bay sole. You can use any kind of seasoning or basting you prefer. I kind of like to keep it simple with just some lemon butter basted over the fish that is turned a few times. Helps to keep it moist and give it a nice flavor. And you can add salt and pepper or other seasonings to taste when you're serving. And then there's catfish ramaki. The traditional ramaki dish is for chicken livers, but I found that catfish pieces work very well too. Just soak your fish in teriyaki sauce for a little while and then wrap them in bacon, skewer them with a toothpick, and then grill them in your wire fish basket until both the bacon and the fish pieces are well done. Catfish are absolutely great when smoked. Their firm flesh takes up the salt and the smoky flavor very well. Here are the basic steps. First of all, I don't like to soak catfish in a wet brine like you do trout or some of the other species. Instead, I sprinkle them generously with a dry sea salt, white sugar, and brown sugar, adding successive layers in a plastic bowl. Now, left overnight in the refrigerator, the salt and the sugar pull a lot of moisture out of the fish, and there's a natural brine solution covering the fish in the morning. Now you need to pour off that brine and thoroughly rinse these fillets to remove the excess salt before you put them in the smoker. Now, next lay the brine fillets on your wire smoking rack and sprinkle on your favorite mix of spicy seasonings. I use what I call a super spice mix with pepper and cayenne and garlic and cumin and oregano, a whole bunch of good stuff, and really gives it a good flavor. But allow them to set and dry for an hour or so after you've seasoned them until a glaze is formed. Then you put them in the smoker, smoke them on a low heat for at least 6 to 8 hours, rotating the racks at midpoint to ensure the even smoking on the top and bottom racks. Now, the choice of smoking woods is optional. I prefer hickory, but almost any good cherry wood, apple wood, alder, aspen, it's all good stuff. Now, the fish pieces shrink noticeably during the smoking process. And as I discovered by leaving the fish in the smoker too long, that catfish jerky is a pretty toothsome snack too. Cut the firm pieces up into small pieces and serve with cheese and crackers and a suitable libation. Now, who doesn't like fish tacos? Fried kitty crispies make great catfish tacos. Just what kind of tortilla, choose what kind of tortilla you want. Pile on your favorite veggies and salsa and lime juice and all that good stuff, and enjoy. Now, to finish up this cooking and recipes part of the video, we just got to mention po' boy sandwiches. I learned to love po' boys while living and working in New Orleans. Pretty simple concept. Just get a good roll and pile it up with kitty crispies, lettuce, tomato, cheese, any other desired ingredients. Use your choice of dressings. I kind of like good tartar sauce. And this concludes our two-part video on catfish, hook to pan. I hope you enjoyed it, and hope you picked up some helpful hints.